what do we do? What does a tolerant society do when it has brought into its own institutions a fiercely intolerant faction that is busy and successfully getting rid of diversity of ideas within most major universities and colleges? And not only that, but starting also in kindergarten, in which they are, like they did in the Soviet Union, making sure that certain precepts of critical race theory and critical gender and critical queer theory are introduced to children as young as 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. Now, where do we go? How do we figure this out?
Right. Well, I mean, if I had an easy answer, right, I'd probably be like queer.
Well, you see, the easy answer for us is, and I've read your stuff, which is leave them alone, but we're still worried.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally
leaving them
agree
alone means we surrender, right? It means surrender at some level.
No, I totally agree with you. And I think that, there is on the left, which, rightly deplores, for instance, certain, bans on books. And I mean, school libraries are kind of a complicated thing, but I mean, there have been attempts to remove certain books from public libraries, which is, really a kind of red light for me. So, I think that there is a completely legitimate alarm about some of the things that, Ron DeSantis, for instance, has been doing. I've written about the situation of this new college, Florida, where I think there has been some real sort of bullying by the DeSantis people and really misrepresentations of what New College was like, because they've been trying to portray it as this sort of woke citadel. My understanding from, both looking at the materials on the college website and talking to people is that it's really not. Anyway, so but I think I am very disappointed when, people on the, well, not in the far left, because the far left doesn't disappoint me. I don't expect anything good from it, but, people in the sort of, center left people who tend to be very kind of nonchalant about threats to free expression and, intellectual discourse from the progressive, social justice left, whatever you want to call it, wokeism. I mean, any word that you use is going to be attacked as, it's just this,
It's just talking about how race has affected us through history. That's all it is.
Of course, right. And it's really just about kindness and
it's just about being kind to people and inclusive. And how could you possibly object to any of that?
So I think that there's a real, and I mean, if you look at some of the pushback to quote unquote cancel culture narratives, it's always this nitpicking about how, oh, well, this anecdote that you used, it's actually not quite the way that you said it was, and it's really not quite as bad. And, and this person got their job back, 6 months later. So, what are you bitching and moaning about, So there's this real tendency to minimize a lot of these incidents. And, I've written about a bunch of those and, trying to get to the bottom of some of these stories. Like, even if, and I don't want to get into this because God knows we're already spend enough time here, but like, even if you look at, for instance, the narratives around the decision by the Dr. Seuss estate to remove some of his old books from publication because they supposedly had, racial stereotypes in them. And by the way, incredibly trivial stuff. And the narratives that have sprung up around that are just completely false, because it's stuff like, I mean, I've heard people say, oh, well, they just removed some old books that weren't selling, that's all. No, they were selling fine. The fact is that there is this,
but isn't this interesting? There is a reflexive attempt to minimize from center-left people to say nothing's happening.
Nothing's
happening. It's not happening. And you're lying. I mean, 2 years ago, they were telling me there's no critical race theory is entirely in Ivy League law schools. It has no influence anywhere. They were literally telling me this. Now, did they know that? No. They were just embarrassed slightly by the stuff that was coming out, and they wanted to keep insisting it wasn't happening. Same with,
if you look at there are articles and scholarly publications that have been written about the takeover by a lot of schools of education by critical pedagogy, which is based on critical race theory. So Now, to what extent, I mean, has every school in the U.S. been taken over by this? I'm sure there are a lot of schools like in conservative areas where, that is not the case. I don't think anyone's really done a systematic study. I'm sure there are areas where the public schools are very conservative and, where you may get looked askance for being an atheist, for instance. So, I mean, I think that the U.S. is so diverse, geographically and culturally, that I think for every statement you have, you're probably going to find a counterexample. So, yeah, I mean, can you find examples like somewhere in very conservative areas, for instance, of teachers getting in trouble with the community, really just for talking about, racism during the 1950s? Yeah, where people say, oh, we really don't want to hear about, the kids who have
Right.
go
Although
to
I think the
integrated
idea
schools.
that kids are not being taught about slavery or
Yeah,
segregation
no, I think
in that is just not true. They
of
are
course
being
not.
taught that, and the idea that this is and also it strikes me as kind of amazing how in many of these red states, because of the national institutions, the teachers unions, and you'd be surprised where this stuff comes up. I mean, we've discovered throughout red states, for example, that the children who seem to be gender dysphoric are often put on these fast track processes to go to have themselves medicalized very quickly, or much more quickly than might otherwise. In other words, these things do have an impact. The question
I totally
is,
agree with you. I think there's a real tendency to minimize the sort of left illiberalism that I think is a very real force.